501cast. Information you need from experts we trust.
Today we're going to talk about careers in nonprofit, which a lot of us are serving in the nonprofit realm sort of by accident. And increasingly we see people choosing this as a career. And we invited our friend and expert of the day, Jeannie Fox, to talk with us about the evolution of nonprofit work as a career. And she's going to visit with us about the history of nonprofits, how nonprofit work has evolved as a profession, what your education choices are when you choose to go into nonprofit work, and then what the outlook is for jobs going forward. Jeannie is a professor with Hamline, and she and I met many, many years ago when we were both new to the nonprofit world, working for Habitat for Humanity in Rapid City, South Dakota. She's been a lobbyist, a chief of staff. She's been very involved in the Council of Nonprofits, faculty for numerous universities. There wasn't even room to list them all. And I'm just so thrilled to introduce her as our expert today. And from here, I will turn it over to Jeannie.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I'm glad you gave a nod to how you and I both started in this world. And I have to throw out some kudos to our AmeriCorps program in the United States. And I hope that maybe some of the people who listen to this conversation think about doing a VISTA or an AmeriCorps year of national service. And that's how Chris and I came to work together at Habitat. And I think, Chris, you made a nonprofit lifer out of me ever since. So thrilled to be with you today and to have this conversation.
Thanks, Jeannie. So I think let's jump right into the history of nonprofits, and I'll let you just roll from there.
Thank you. And I'm not going to talk too much about the history, but one thing I do want you to walk away with is that nonprofits have always been a part of the building of this country. We actually kind of brought the tradition of helping the poor over with us, as this goes back to our colonial beginnings. Even you can Google the Elizabethan Poor Laws of 1601. But nonprofits took on a uniquely American flavor once they were here. So if anyone ever took a political science course, you probably read Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French philosopher and thinker. He came to a very young United States in 1831 to look at our prison system. But what he observed while he was here and later wrote about in a 2-volume set called Democracy in America is this unique system of regular people coming together to solve problems. So remember, he's coming from Europe with very strong government systems that provided for people, and our, individualist U.S. beginnings that continue to this day. We tend to prefer private solutions in our society here, and nonprofits are the vehicle for people to come together and make the world a better place. So there's a long history of doing this, and the U.S. has one of the largest nonprofit sectors in the world, still growing now and globally as well. So a couple things I want to talk about is just the size and scope of this sector. There are roughly 1.5 million nonprofit tax-exempt organizations registered with the Internal Revenue Service. That's our federal agency that kind of governs nonprofits. That number doesn't even include churches who don't have to register in the same way. It doesn't include all the, small nonprofits, volunteer run that, aren't generating 25, 50,000 worth of activity. So if you factor all those in, it's well over 2 million in the US. And they account for 5.4% of the gross domestic product. So there's actually a high level of activity and economic benefit generated by nonprofits. So usually when we talk about nonprofits, people think about the services they provide and how they build strong communities, and the very important role nonprofits play. But we don't often step back and think about nonprofits as employers. And that's a very important part of the economy. So I want to spend some time on that today. Nonprofit employees make up over 10% of the workforce nationally. In certain states, in many states, it's over 14, 15%. So we are a significant part of the workforce. Public charities in the US hold over $3 trillion in charitable assets. So we are stewards of, public trust and public funds. And over 25% of adults in the US volunteer time with an organization and generally donate an average of 2% of their salaries to causes that they care about. So I just kind of wanted to start off with some of these facts to say, you're part of something larger. I know when I first started working in nonprofits, whether it was a domestic violence shelter or a mental health center, we can kind of think in our silos sometimes, but it was many years later that I kind of got a bigger sense of, oh, wow, no, we have a unique role in society. And that's one of the things we'll be talking about today. So let me give you a little bit let's talk a little bit about what I consider kind of the professionalizing of nonprofits. I had gone on, I knew I wanted to do graduate school. I had no identity of a nonprofit sector, never even heard that language before. And I just knew I wanted to help people. So I kind of ended up in the human services track and got a clinical degree. So I was very quickly, though, in administration and directors of programs, but it was 7 years before I had as much as even a workshop on how to read a spreadsheet or a financial statement. And I'm just so thrilled that it's not that way anymore. I was really lucky. I had good mentors. I had people like Chris that I worked with, and, some really good people that had the heart of, a passionate nonprofit leader, but also had business sense to know we need to run this organization as a business, so to speak. And so I got lucky. But today there are so many choices. I'm excited now at this point in my career to be part of educating new generations of nonprofit leaders. And you're going to come out so much more equipped than I was just from the get-go. So, I graduated from college in the mid to late 80s, and nonprofit programs were actually just starting to pop up, mostly on the East Coast, right? We're still a westward expansion country. So everything kind of starts on the East Coast and has moved its way west. So you do see of the almost 300 colleges and universities that offer some type of nonprofit course or program. They're centered in the Northeast. We have quite a few in the Midwest. I'm sitting in Minnesota as we speak. Less so in the West and the Southwest, but definitely a growing field. And as an academic field, nonprofit studies is really quite new. So we're talking 25, 30 years of these programs. There is a lot of need for research on the sector. I'm going to mention in a minute one of the pioneer scholars in nonprofit education, but there is more to do to kind of own our space in academia, as well as the workforce and all the other parts of society we touch. So if you're interested in this kind of movement, I feel like my career has really followed the arc of professionalizing of the field, and I've watched this happen from the inside, and now stepping back as a scholar myself, to study these trends. But Google Roseanne Mirabella, Seton Hall University, back in 95, 96, Professor Mirabella started looking at where are these programs, what do they offer, what academic department should they live in? Should they be in a public policy school or public affairs? Should they sit in a school of business and management? And, there's lots of debate about, where's the best place for these programs to live. But the important thing is they're out there for you to take advantage of. There's 132 colleges that have some sort of an undergraduate program. It's most often seen at the graduate level of, specializing. There's 168 graduate degree programs around the country. And where I work, Hamline University, we are a member of the Nonprofit Academic Centers Council. That's a group of about 50 graduate degree programs around the country that have a set alone, nonprofit degree that isn't just part of an MBA or part of a public administration degree, but in my case, I direct a Master of Nonprofit Management. So they're out there. I encourage you to look at some of those options if you're thinking about going back to school. And we'll walk through also some of the alternatives to starting a nonprofit. So as an undergrad or graduate student, people are eligible to apply for financial aid. A lot of colleges give scholarships for various purposes, merit or otherwise. At the program I direct, we believe so much in national service that if you have done an AmeriCorps or VISTA, Teach for AmeriCorps, the military, any kind of national service, you automatically get a 10% discount on tuition for your entire program. So there are ways out there. I know nobody wants to take on debt, but I will say, at least from the era I came out of, if I had not gotten the master's degree when I did, I would not have had the opportunities that I've been fortunate to have, both in government and nonprofit settings. And I will say just briefly, there is a lot of overlap between our partners in government, and particularly if you're involved in human services like I was, because increasingly counties or other government units don't want to necessarily deliver the services, but they want them available for their residents. So we have a long history of government contracting with nonprofits to deliver important services. So in my classes, it's hard to talk about nonprofits without talking about government as well. And a lot of leaders do go back and forth between those entities. A quick word about practice versus research, and then I will pause, Chris, because I'm talking a lot here, so maybe you have questions.
Oh, no,
but
keep going. This is what we want to listen to you. So,
okay, we'll definitely do questions as well. I am working for what I would consider a teaching university that is very much about theory to practice. And I'm doing doctoral work myself, but we believe in, tying theory and academic pursuit with, well, how does this really work, on the ground? So that's the core of our kind of program at Hamline University. But that's one thing you'll want to look at if you want to pursue advanced studies. Whether you want to be at a top 10 research facility and do the purely academic research and scholarship, or like in the PhD program I'm in, all my colleagues are actually running nonprofits or directors of government offices and units, and they plan to continue being practitioners, but they want the frameworks in which to really make change and the advanced study. So, there are different flavors of the programs depending on what your goals are. And now we're, as I said, 300 colleges, there's a lot out there. You can find what's a good fit for you. So just like with any job, if you're looking at training or degree programs, you want to know what's the philosophy of the program and what are you actually training people to do. So why don't you keep moving, Chris? Let's run through some of these slides here, and then we'll pause and just have a conversation. So you may already have a college degree, even a graduate degree. Maybe that's what you need. Maybe you just want to hone some certain skills. I know a lot of people in my generation, like I did, went out and got a different master's degree. But like I said, I never got the like financial training. So if that's your situation and you just want to kind of either be introduced for the first time or brush up on some skills, there are a number of places that you can do, you know, a 1-day, 2-day training or workshop. Certainly colleges and universities offer those as well. I would also look in your communities for something we typically call a management support organization. Here in Minnesota, we have something called Propel Nonprofits, but they're all over the country. And those kind of organizations exist to help make the work of running a nonprofit smoother, easier, and for you to get the education and training that you feel you need. So you could do a certificate on fundraising. You could do a half-day workshop on financial statements. Another source of this kind of shorter training is the continuing education programs, which a lot of universities have. I would also look at what we call a nonprofit state association network. So 40 of the 50 states in the United States have a state council. Chris mentioned that I worked for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits for many years. Those kind of organizations exist to promote and support the work of nonprofits. So they often have an annual conference, offer many, many trainings and workshops and networking activities throughout the year, where you can find some of those kind of subject specific, whether it's finance or budgeting or governance. So things are out there. Maybe just need to do a little Google searching, or you'll see my email at the end. And certainly Chris's organization is doing some of that as well. And we're here to help support the nonprofit network. So lots of options there. So we can maybe move past training, because a lot of people want to know, well, just what about jobs and what kind of career can I have? And I hope my resume is a testament to the amazing things you can do by committing yourself to do community-based work. In fact, events of this year in 2020, we've all been impacted by a global pandemic. In my state of Minnesota, we've recently had a very sad and tragic, potentially racially motivated death, and the whole world is responding. So I would say these are reminders to us that the world needs more of what nonprofits do. And so the future is bright, I believe, in that the nonprofit sector is growing. So even through the recessions of 2007, 8, 9, the number of nonprofits continued to grow. The wage gap between nonprofit employees and government and private sector employees is shortening. And so there are good jobs available. Again, if you want to geek out, I want to make sure I list some resources that I pull from. So you can, if you're really interested in the area of nonprofits as part of the economy, go to the Johns Hopkins website. And this is a university in the East Coast. And there is a Center for Civil Society. Lester Salomon, like Roseanne Mirabella, again, a very early pioneer in recognizing that the nonprofit sector itself needed to be studied as a thing. So one of the things Lester Salomon's team have has been doing is issuing basically nonprofit economy reports. So here's something that might surprise you. When we look at industries, nonprofits make up the third largest workforce in the United States.
Wow.
Behind retail trade and kind of the food and hospitality industry. We're just on par with manufacturing as an industry. So in the US, that's over 12.3 million jobs, million employees just in the US. So we contribute in a variety of ways. And don't, you always hear, oh, nonprofits, they don't pay taxes. Well, that's not exactly accurate, because nonprofits pay payroll taxes. In some cases, they pay sales or even property taxes. Nonprofits are tax exempt from the income tax because, receiving government dollars or individual donations or foundation grants, any profit is to be built back into programs and services to better communities. But nonprofits are contributing to the community in a variety of ways. So let me tell you where the jobs are. If you decide, okay, I want to be in nonprofits because I don't want to be motivated just by a financial benefit. The largest, now I'm going to talk about subsectors of nonprofits, because nonprofits come in all kinds of flavors and colors, right? We have hospitals and universities and art museums and food shelves and domestic violence shelters and homeless programs. So, but the largest categories of nonprofits are what colloquially I tend to call the meds and eds. All right. These are the hospitals and universities. They're the largest employers that are under a nonprofit legal structure. So we're certainly in an era, with aging baby boomers, a global pandemic. Healthcare is ever more important and will be for years to come. So hospitals, clinics, nursing homes, those are all very large nonprofit employers. So lots of opportunities there. Colleges and universities, we tend to think of them as, this school or that school, but the private ones are all nonprofits. So that's a distinction made from, the University of South Dakota. I shouldn't say that because I'm a South Dakota State grad. Or in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, those are state institutions. But the smaller liberal arts type colleges that exist around the country are all private nonprofits and tend to employ a large number of people. And then the third category is more often what we tend to think of as nonprofit is all our social service agencies serving families and individuals, maybe providing housing or heating assistance or any number of services. So those three categories alone make up 81% of all US nonprofit jobs, with over half of them, 55%, being in the medical, healthcare world, 14% in education, 12% in social services. So then there are a number of, jobs in much smaller shops, the arts, environmental organizations, many other kinds of nonprofits, but I thought I would just point out what some of the biggies are.
Jeannie, does that include 501c3 and C6 organizations? Is that does the demographic breakdown the same, or is that just C3 type sector you're talking about? Like if you think about the National Association of Home Builders, like huge trade associations that employ hundreds or thousands of people, is the demographic the same, whether C3 or C6?
That's a great question and a very educated question. There are 29 sections under the 501c tax code that govern nonprofits. And thank you for letting me make this clarification. The numbers I've been sharing with you are only the 501c3 charitable tax exempt organizations. So many of the others may be tax exempt from income tax. The rules vary a little bit with the 4, 5, 6s, 7s, some of the other more common types of organizations. Donations to them might not be tax exempt, but they can, engage in elections and lobbying in a way. The C3s have limitations. So that's where the differences start to come up. But the bulk of the sector is in 501c3. And that's the extent of my remarks today are all about the 501c3, kind of our typical nonprofits. But I'll just mention, because your audience will know many of them, 501c4s are groups like the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy or Planned Parenthood, other groups that might have a 3 to deliver services and a 4 where they do a higher amount of advocacy in trying to change systems. 501c5s, you may not have heard that term, but everybody knows them. They're labor unions. And again, they're nonprofit, but they have a different set of rules. So this gets very confusing for the public because they might see a labor union endorse a candidate for office and say, well, I thought nonprofits weren't supposed to be political. But it really depends on what type of nonprofit you are. And then the 501c6s are what you're talking about with some of the trade associations, your chambers of commerce, and the 7s are the fraternal organizations. So anything that has an animal name, the moose, the elks, the VFWs, and those types of organizations. So, the nonprofit sector is so vast and so diverse. And the downside of that is it's confusing for the public sometimes because we just use this generic term nonprofit. And media don't always know how to report these distinctions. But there is a place for you, no matter what type of work you want to do. If you want to give back to community in a variety of ways, be it political, be it, just community-based, frontline needs, high-end art museums, we've got it all in the nonprofit sector.
Thanks. We might have to do a whole nother C-cast or a cast on the different types of Cs, right? Like run them down and what the differences are.
Yeah,
for today, that's a good overview. So current trends and retirement and COVID, anything else on those?
Yep. Well, not to out you at age, but I think you and I are similar age. I identify as Gen X, and those of us have been waiting and waiting and waiting for the boomers to retire. That is happening.
I'm a boomer.
So are you a boomer? All right. Well, you could stay. You could stay for a while.
Everyone but me.
We've
right?
got work we can do. But, there were many, many organizations founded in, the 80s. And those founders are still there as the executive director. And they've grown these organizations and new ones have come online. But just like we're about to experience in philanthropy, the largest generational transfer of wealth that we've ever seen in the US, so too will leaders be handing over these organizations to younger leaders and leaders potentially with different backgrounds, different experiences. So that's, to me, one of the beauties of the sector is even volunteer experience is valued. When I look at applications to come into our master's program at Hamline University, I don't care if it's paid or volunteer work experience. I just want to know how have you intersected with the nonprofit sector? And people don't even realize that's what they're doing. They're like, well, I just, went with my church and we did this food thing. Well, those are both nonprofits. But that's the kind of experience that I look for. I want to mention, I brought up Johns Hopkins in their nonprofit economy reports, which you can find online, or I could send you a link if you want to post it. But they took a look at the decade of basically spanning 2007, beginning of our last major recession until now, up to 2016. And during that time, the nonprofit workforce increased by 16.7%. So it's pretty significant. And during that same period, nonprofits actually outpaced private companies almost 4 times over. So private business expanded over that time 4.6%. So we're at 16. The other thing is private companies and government retrenched during the recession, but nonprofits didn't. And there is kind of a counter-cyclical nature to this as well. When the country is going through an economic crisis or other, could be a flood, a hurricane, civil unrest like we're seeing now, nonprofits respond and either do more or create new programs to respond to those changing needs. So, we're typically seen as more nimble, more flexible than government or even private companies. And that growth is evident in virtually every state. So, as I mentioned, there are some states that have more nonprofits, or maybe they have a state association, but this is a long-term trend. I would say some of these growth areas we are seeing for-profit entities come in as well. And then we have to be able to talk about, well, how are we different? How is Lifetime Fitness different from a YMCA or a nonprofit daycare over a for-profit daycare? So, that's getting a little bit in the weeds. But you can be assured, nonprofits, I believe, are the most resilient sector, and the people who work for nonprofits tend to be very resilient, driven by their passion, but also need to know some basics, not only about the law and legal requirements for nonprofits, but how to run those organizations in the sense of financial management, human, resource management, and fundraising and strategic planning and governance. Those are really the fun elements of what it takes to run a nonprofit organization.
Mm-hmm. And then, so retirement and shortage, you see that there will be a continued need for people entering this workforce as boomers retire, founders retire, new people coming in. Is there already a shortage in the industry for skilled workers, or is it stable and that is like a projected need?
It has been projected, and we're in the beginnings of it. And I think, it does vary depending on where you are geographically. But your generation, Chris, that boomer generation is, the largest, and the generations that followed, were just smaller, period, as a number of people. And in colleges and universities, we're about to face the smallest class of people who are graduating high school right now. So that's something, universities have had to plan for, just with the demographics. There's a smaller group of people. So, it's a little bit like a funnel, and any state demographic office will have statistics on that you could look at. So the opportunities are definitely there. Mm-hmm. But I think even if it weren't, projected shortages, I think it's okay to recognize that maybe we haven't always been doing things in the best way, or maybe, too small of groups or populations have been getting to decide and run these organizations. So the nonprofit sector is still a little too white, a little too female, depending on the type of business. We need younger people and people of color to be running their own organizations alongside us, or in place of, or in addition to. So one thing I really do feel that describes the nonprofit sector is that we're collaborative. It can be competitive in ways, but for the most part, there's room for everybody at the table, and we need to live and breathe that. So just like our demographics are changing in states and in the country, so too will our nonprofits, and I see that as a good thing.
Yeah, we were just, interesting point, we were just having a staff conversation yesterday about the lack of diversity in nonprofits and what can be done about it. And we might have to have a whole another cast about that, because there were some interesting
Yeah.
observations about the perception of, you know, if you're going to break out of a cycle of poverty, for example, that a career in nonprofit is not exactly what you think of. You know, you think like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I'm going to, and then there's almost this perception that like, if you're going to break out of any socioeconomic barriers that exist, you're going to hit this low ceiling if you go into nonprofit. And so we should schedule another talk specifically about targeting racial diversity and gender diversity in nonprofits, because it's very interesting to us as a staff, primarily white, primarily female, and we don't necessarily want it to be that way. But we respond to the people who seek jobs with us, you know? So a whole, boy, we could go down a rabbit hole there. What about COVID-19?
I will get to COVID. Let me just say one more comment on that is we could do a whole one on board recruitment, because last time I looked it up, 98% of all board members of all the organizations in the US were over 30. And, you know, I think we need younger people on boards. If we looked at the racial diversity, it would be very low as well, too. So, you know, nonprofit boards, and that, like I said, is a whole other topic. But if we look specifically at, you know, nonprofits are self-governed by a community board of directors, right? There's no owner like in a for-profit. There's no one person that gets to benefit and take home, you know, that pocket, the profits. But these board of directors are generally seen as community leaders. They're visible, they're good at raising money and donating money, and have a certain amount of power over how these organizations run. And they're even more extremely, in that case, white, male, and high education, high income. And, you know, what does that mean for an organization that's maybe serving homeless immigrants on the front line, right? So having boards that actually reflect the services you provide would be a great topic.
Right. Yeah.
COVID-19.
Months of sessions lined up.
You're right. Okay, this might be the only downer note of this conversation, is that I do believe there will be some nonprofits who do not survive the pandemic, in the sense of having to shutter their doors, not being able to deliver services in the way that they're accustomed, seeing their donor base maybe decrease for a variety of reasons. Certainly just the economic impacts of the pandemic alone and what it's done to the stock market hurts endowments, and it hurts individual donors' ability to maintain giving at a level maybe they have been. So there are a number of reasons. You know, if an organization didn't have the reserves on hand, or a different way to pivot services, or a different way to bring in revenue, they're going to be extremely, extremely challenged. So what we don't know is this short term. Is this, you know, you need to be able to ride it out for 3 more months or 3 more years. You know, that's kind of what remains to be seen. But I think it's clear that it may definitely impact the sector in that way.
Right, no question. And again, C3 is your ability to donate. C6, like if you're a member of a trade organization, one of the first things to hit the cutting room floor is going to be your membership dues, and or going to that national conference you enjoy so much every year. So they're really interesting. You know, that was what we had listed as an outline, and I am open to a bit more conversation if there's anything else you want to share. We try to keep to 30 minutes, and I don't know where we really are, but anything else you want to share before we the time goes by, and I think we've scratched the surface on so many other topics.
Exactly. This was kind of a big overview, but again, you know, my goal was to step back and take a look at nonprofits as a section of the economy, as employers, and to try and let people know there are many good job opportunities in the nonprofit sector, and some of them actually pay quite well. But again, in those bigger types of organizations, the hospitals, the universities and others, but not wanting to end on the sad note of COVID and that we will lose organizations, just like we're losing, sadly, some people. It has also created more need in certain types of organizations. So we are seeing creativity and innovation in how nonprofits either serve high-risk populations who have health issues, responding to some of the needs of the community that have come about because of the pandemic. So again, when we're hurting the worst, I'll close with how I started. The world needs more of what nonprofits do. And I thank you for this opportunity to come on and kind of be a cheerleader, because I love this part of American society.
Yeah, so do we. Thank you so much. So I'll look forward to our next session, and we'll keep everyone posted on what that will be. Thanks again.